Innovators, Changemakers, and Entrepreneurs. This is Kevin Kimley. This is a show about the people past, present, and future who change the world. They make decisions and take actions enlivened by what I call the entrepreneur's ethic. The entrepreneur's ethic infuses people and organizations where the future is created and the world is made a better place. One of the entrepreneurs featured in my upcoming book, The Entrepreneur's Ethic, is the early 19th century Boston entrepreneur Francis Cabot Lowell. Lowell launched a business, Boston Manufacturing Company, that pioneered integrated cotton textile manufacturing. Its importance was not just in the emerging American textile industry, but in providing a template for the audacious launch of many, many large businesses and industries in the coming centuries. There are 7 parts of the entrepreneur's ethic. Lowell's work exemplifies Ethic 1, make things happen. This is the action orientation of entrepreneurship. In this episode, I explore the historic role of textiles in development of technologies, industries, and civilization itself with Virginia Postrel, author of the book, The Fabric of Civilization. We discuss how the importance of textiles has been overlooked, the idea of social technologies, and what we can learn from the history of textiles as it applies to competitive dynamics and creative destruction today. I enjoyed this conversation with Virginia, and know you will too. Virginia Postrel is an author, columnist, and speaker whose work spans a broad range of topics, from social science to fashion, concentrating on the intersection of culture, commerce, and technology. She's a visiting fellow at the Smith Institute for Political Economy and Philosophy at Chapman University, where she teaches classes combining the humanities and economics. She's been a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, the New York Times, and Forbes, and its companion technology magazine, Forbes ASAP. She's been editor of Reason magazine and has been a reporter for Inc. and the Wall Street Journal. She received a degree in English literature from Princeton University. Her latest book, and how I got introduced to your work, Virginia, is The Fabric for Civilization, How Textiles Made the World. It examines development of technology, industry, and commerce through the history of textiles from prehistoric times to the near future. Virginia, thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Great to be with you.
So my dive into textiles was very shallow compared to yours, but that's where I ran across your work. In developing my own book, The Entrepreneur's Ethic, came across an entrepreneur from the early history of the United States named Francis Cabot Lowell, and dove a little bit into the early history of the textile industry in the United States. And I'd been broadly at least aware of its role in what's been described as the Industrial Revolution starting in Great Britain. But then I found a reference to your book and just really enjoyed learning so much more. And so at the beginning of the book, you write that the central role of textiles in the history of technology, commerce, and civilization itself has been overlooked. Why was it overlooked, and in what ways?
Well, there are a couple of different answers to that question. It depends on your historical time frame. So if you look at ancient textiles and textiles in the very earliest days, even going back to prehistory, they tend to be overlooked because they rot, to put it bluntly. For a very long time, archaeologists paid almost no attention to textiles and paleontologists because textiles weren't there in large numbers. And that has changed, and it's really changed dramatically in about the past 25 to 30 years. And now there is careful attention paid, and there have been some remarkable discoveries, everything from a 6,200-year-old piece of fabric that was dyed with indigo and fashioned into stripes using 2 different colors of plant fibers and indigo from Peru, in an area where it's dry enough for there to be textiles preserved, to between the time that I finished my manuscript, and the time about 6 to 8 weeks later, when I revised it, a paper was published having found, identified 50,000-year-old string made by Neanderthals. Now, string is not textiles, but it's the first stage.
It's a good start
to getting to it. So that's one story. And some of these, there are other kinds of very early textile remains that are identified not by the textiles themselves, but by impressions that are left on pottery or mineralizations where you had a piece of fabric and there's been mineralization, and you can see the pattern. And once upon a time, archaeologists used to clean those off, whereas now they're preserved very preciously. So that's one answer. The other answer is that the central role of textiles is something that our grandparents would have understood, and certainly their grandparents would have understood, because from the time, really, the Industrial Revolution starts with spinning machines in the late 18th century. And at that stage, textiles start to become abundant, but there's still a major, major industry. And so lots of people work in that industry. Lots of people supply that industry. It consumes a large portion of household budgets. And that's really true right up until maybe the 1970s or 80s. But textiles and clothing constitute a lower and lower percentage of household budgets, and fewer, particularly in developed countries, fewer people work in those industries. And so it's easy to forget it then. So that's the really recent sort of story. For most of human history, really, up until, for most of human history, up until the Industrial Revolution, textile production was a major concern. You were either doing it in your household, or you were involved in the industry, or you were supplying the industry. And by industry, I mean hand weaving or hand spinning, or you were spending a significant portion of your household budget on it. People used to, if you look at criminal records from, say, the 18th century, there's a lot of stealing of clothes off of laundry, or other kinds of textiles, because they're very valuable. So that's it. There's a historical story about archaeology and textiles being hard to preserve, and then there's an economic story about I say at the end of the book, we suffer from textile amnesia because we enjoy textile abundance.
Well, you give me a flash to the first house that we bought. If I'm remembering correctly, it was built in 1923. And when we were going through looking at the deed, I remember it was referred to, or perhaps even in the sale, when we bought it, it was referred to as a Sears Roebuck home.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And I'm like, what is that? And people used to order homes from the Sears catalog, and the kit would come and you would build it or hire somebody to build it. But anyway, it was a little bungalow home. The bedrooms were small to begin with, but they had built-in closets,
right,
which are a much more modern idea than 1923. And then they became really tiny for the rest of the space in the room to have a dresser and a bed and all of that sort of thing. But I remember laughing because in the 1920s, when it was built, the idea of having a closet wasn't a part of a normal home.
And if you rent an Airbnb in an older home in someplace in Europe, chances are you will not have a built-in closet. You'll have an armoire, or you'll have a wall of closets that came from IKEA that were installed, after the fact. But closets are relatively new, and big closets are really new. So the closet that I grew up with in a house that was built in 1973 would be shameful today.
The idea of a walk-in closet, a room all by itself.
Yeah, right.
Well, in what ways did development of textile production and then technologies reflect development of human creativity, of innovation and entrepreneurship, things that I think about for the programs that I run at the university, but really are a rich story as well?
Right. Well, textiles, a big theme of the book is that the story of textiles is the story of human ingenuity in all its manifestations. So you've got various let's go back to that 6,200-year-old scrap of fabric from Peru. You have got, we don't know about the entrepreneurial side of it. We don't know enough about that culture to know what sort of economic institutions it had. But we can see that someone had figured out how to harvest fiber from local plants, from at least two kinds of plants, from cotton and from a milkweed plant that had a bright white fiber, to spin those into thread, which is a technology that is invented in there's a very simple version that's invented basically everywhere around the world in slightly different forms, but essentially a stick with a weight. And that allows you to take short fibers, short weak fibers, and stretch them into long thread that is strong and for as many miles and miles as you need. So you've got an agricultural story, whether that's cultivated or not. 6,200 years ago, probably was cultivated. Then you've got a simple mechanical story about spinning, and there you've got dyeing. And indigo dye is unbelievably complicated chemically. It's I go into it some in the book, but essentially you have to put the leaves from the plant in water, and then you can get an indigo precipitate, but you can't dye with it unless you transform it into something else, and then you put the cloth or the fiber in and it turns green, and then you pull it out and it turns blue, and it's a crazy system. And if anybody has an opportunity to take an indigo workshop, I encourage them to do so. Well, people invented this all over the world. Obviously they invented it in Peru, and that used one kind of plant. They invented it in India, hence the word indigo, which used a different plant. They invented it in Europe, where it was called woad, which used a different plant. They invented it in parts of Africa, again, a different plant. These plants aren't even related to each other. And in various parts of Asia. It was invented all around the world, this crazy, complicated chemical process. And that was something that occurred because people were observant and because they learned through trial and error.
I was going to say, you document really well some of the evidence of what that trial and error looked like, and then some of the modern people trying to recreate
some of the things, especially with the famous Tyrian purple from the shellfish, which is mentioned in ancient Roman sources. It's mentioned in the Bible. We know it was popular. It was popular right up through the Byzantine Empire. But when the Byzantine Empire fell to the Turks, at that point, it had become a monopoly of royalty. It wasn't it was always a luxury. You always had to be rich to have it, but it was only in the Byzantine Empire that it became a monopoly of royalty, and only a few people knew how to do the dyeing, and that knowledge was lost. And so scientists and archaeologists try to recreate it today. And some of them do it by trying to figure out what the chemistry must have been and then do it. But I talk about a woman from Washington University in St. Louis who recreated it by hands-on practice with one of her grad students and discovered it's a really disgusting process. But she did succeed. And then in terms of entrepreneurship, many of the earliest business records that we have, the earliest records of contracts and agents and lawsuits and the earliest records of long distance trade are about 4,000 years old, and they are from a site in Turkey, uh, which was sort of the expat outpost. It was a town uh, uh, called Kanesh that textile and tin merchants from a place that's near Mosul in what's now Mosul in Iraq uh, would bring their wares to. And so we have their end of the correspondence. And these are remarkably sophisticated business records. I mean, I quote some that were kind of enjoyable to me. They also record a lot about family relations and family/business relations. But
I think you had a husband and wife
yeah,
correspondence.
so I had
a little bit of
yeah,
business and a little bit of
yeah,
husband-wife stuff.
right, exactly. So I quote one that is a wife who is back in Assur, the source, and she's providing. She's doing the weaving and getting the cloth made, and then she's writing to say this guy is bringing you this and this guy is bringing you that, because they had to, be carried to the place. And then she's saying, why is it what is this business about? I'm not sending you the right stuff. I send you great stuff. Basically, and I say it's this little piece of a marriage, but it's also a classic business thing of the outside guy and the inside guy, and the outside guy says, why can't you make what I can sell? And the inside guy says, why can't you sell what I make? And that's a classic struggle between sort of manufacturing and sales, or whatever you want to say. And this is 44,000 years old. So we have a lot at textile production. Textile trade is one of the earliest trades, and dye stuffs are some of the earliest also things that are traded. We think when you hear about the spice trade, even in the sort of early modern period, and some of that was what we would recognize as spices like nutmeg and things like that, but people in that category were also dye stuffs. So things like indigo, things like cochineal, these were major products of trade.
Yeah, I've always liked to sort of hypothesize, at least, that times change, but people not so much.
Yeah.
And so
right. And that's one of the delightful things about studying history, and especially when you get to occasionally read things that were written by individuals expressing their individual voices, is you have a sense of how different things were, and yet so this simultaneous sense of difference and sameness is just wonderful. And I think that part of studying something like textiles is that textiles themselves are something we all have experiences with. It's not some exotic thing. From the moment you're born, you're wrapped in cloth. And so we all know about textiles. We know what they are. Some people know more than others. One thing I learned was how little regular people know nowadays. Like, they don't know the difference between knitting and weaving, or that sort of thing. But still, we know what a textile is. We know what it does. It's not like trying to explain, what's the difference between bronze and brass or something like that.
Sure. Well, on that people part of it, that's kind of on the production end, if you will, of textiles, you also do a wonderful job giving the history on more of the demand end.
Right.
And some of the very human behavior issues that play an issue like that, like the desire for distinction, for status, for beauty. These things have been around for a long time. What kind of role did you find really interesting about kind of the demand side and how it's influenced textiles?
Yeah, because the production side is so interesting. It's easy to forget that the whole reason that people do all these things is because somebody wants textiles. And so there are a number of interesting stories and examples of how that plays out. Going back to the purple dye, the famous Tyrian purple. One of the things that is interesting about that dye is not only is it very difficult and unpleasant to produce, and therefore expensive, but unlike, say, indigo, which is smelly when you're dyeing it, but it's perfectly fine once the cloth is, washed
Finished.
and finished. It doesn't smell. The Tyrian purple did smell. It kept smelling, and there are Roman poets, the satirical poet Martial, who in a couple of different poems talks about how it smelled, and talks about a rich woman who was using it supposedly to mask her body odor, and it's in another place where it's in a list of bad smells, and what even in the modern recreation of it, which was done like 20 years ago, that cloth still smells, and it has been washed and tied in a modern washing machine. So why would people be going around with stinky clothes? And the reason is that proves it's the real thing. It proves that you've got the expensive kind. It's not a plant substitute. It's not, you didn't over dye red with indigo. You didn't do some cheat. This is the real deal. Also, of course, we're living in a much smellier time than our time today. But so that's one thing. Another aspect of consumer behavior that I discuss is there's often, because particularly clothing, but textiles in general are often associated with specific ranks in society, measures of status. It's quite common for ruling classes, for governments to say who can and cannot wear certain things, which are called sumptuary laws. And sometimes it's in the name of just restricting luxury, but it's often tied to some hierarchical sense of society. And what I found when I delved into the scholarly literature about sumptuary laws is that this plays out very differently in different places. So, for example, in China, in traditional China, you have a Confucian hierarchy, and every sort of class in the Confucian hierarchy has very specific things that they can and cannot wear. There are other things too, of like their houses and stuff, but and it tends to break down, but it breaks down in such a way as to maintain the hierarchy. That is, the highest stuff is always the most prestigious. It's just you might be cheating and wearing something above your rank. And in some cases, the emperor might have even given you clothing that was above your rank. But still, this emperor-centered Confucian hierarchy. In Japan, which was also a Confucian-influenced society, there was a slightly different hierarchy, but pretty similar. And there were sumptuary laws. And the sort of merchant class didn't disobey the sumptuary laws. They found loopholes in them, and they created sort of their own fashion system, if you will. So if they weren't allowed to wear certain luxurious types of fabrics or colors on the outside, they'd put them on the lining of their garments. And it developed into this kind of fashion ideal. It's called Iki, but it's this idea of subtlety. And then my favorite is in the Italian merchants city-states, because most of these sumptuary laws are about sort of keeping the entrepreneurial merchant commercial classes down. But these, places like Florence, they were run by those people. So why would they adopt sumptuary laws? And there it seems to be a way of trying to essentially create sort of a cartel to control their household budgets. So when your wife or daughter comes to you and wants this extraordinarily expensive new kind of dress, you say, no, it's illegal. You can't have it. The problem is that it doesn't last. I mean, they find all kinds of ways around it. And then what happens is another sort of interesting commercial twist is that what used to be fines, punishment, become permits. So you can pay a certain amount, and it's not just women. There were these very, very short tunics that men would wear to show off their their legs, which was a thing for a long time, up until the 18th century, of men showing off their legs. Anyway, and so you could pay a certain fee, and then you would be allowed to wear those very short tunics, or you would be allowed to wear a dress with a certain type of decoration. So that's another aspect.
Governing bodies are open to payoff.
Right, exactly. And then, of course, my favorite example, and I have a video on this on my YouTube channel if people want to check it out, that gives more detail, is about how France, starting under Louis XIV, for 73 years, treated calicos, which were printed cotton fabrics, and in fact, cotton fabrics in general and prints in general, basically the way the US treats cocaine. It was like a super crazy form of protectionism, but instead of just being a tariff or something, it was this criminal prohibition, which again was widely flouted.
Very French then and now. If we look at textiles today, what we wear, how our clothes are produced, and we touched on this a little bit at the beginning, but how can that help us understand that we live in a wealthier world compared to 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 500 years ago, or 2,000 years ago?
Right. Well, we really do have a remarkable abundance of textiles, and to the point that today, when people talk about textile problems, they talk about problems of abundance, problems of too many textiles, problems of too much discarded clothes. What do you do about that? Or dyeing has always been a messy, nasty, stinky, polluting process going back forever. But today we worry about it much more, and that's, I would argue, primarily a problem of scale. So that it's not that, back in the day when people used plants and animals to make dyes, everything was groovy and we didn't have nasty chemicals. Well, first of all, they're all chemicals. And secondly, it was nasty and everybody wanted it elsewhere, on a different side of town or another part. But when you were dyeing millions and millions and millions of yards of cloth every year, it becomes much more of an environmental concern. So that's one thing. But one example I think that really shows it is through most of human history, clothes are made of rectangles, which is how they come off the loom, how textiles come off the loom. So you can think about this in terms of traditional dress. That could be a Roman toga. It could be African kente cloth and similar garments, which are also worn in a toga style fashion. It could be a kimono or a sarong, but it's also the case that even what might look like tailored garments, European peasant garments, are also made of rectangles, that they're just like a gathered skirt. So you take a piece of fabric and you make it so that you gather it at the waist, but you don't cut it. Similarly, sleeves would be made out of rectangles and gathered to fit toward the body. And that tailored clothing comes in the early modern period for very rich people. But it only becomes a common thing for ordinary people really in the 18th century, and that's largely because of secondhand markets. And then in the 19th century, as fabrics become more abundant. And one aspect of this is that while quilting is ancient, the idea of having two pieces of cloth with something sewn in between to keep people warm, up until the 19th century, it's basically large pieces, again, rectangles. They might be from old worn out clothes, but they'd be conserving every bit of cloth that you possibly could. It's only in the early 19th century that you start getting patchwork quilts the way we think of it. And it's not just in America, although it's very much an American thing, but it's also in Britain, where people can afford, even in their cutting up their old clothes, to cut them up into neat little squares or neat little hexagons, things that leave little pieces on the floor. And that's because fabric has become abundant, and especially in the mid 19th century, when you start to get synthetic dyes, then you also start to have not only fabric but color as abundant.
And you had some interesting statistics. I'm not going to be able to cite them off the top of my head, but how many essentially human hours it took to make a yard of cloth or something.
Yeah, so this is the story of spinning throughout, again, most of human history up to the late 18th century, 19th century. Women around the world spent most of their lives spinning. I mean, just the numbers are just enormous. You can, and that's why you see there are lots of people. If you start to pay attention, you see lots of pictures in European art of women spinning, going back to Greek vases, but particularly in later art. And the reason is that it takes a long time to spin enough cloth to make anything. So when you see somebody who's good at spinning, it looks like magic. I mean, it just looks like this thread is just coming and coming. It's amazing, and it looks pretty fast, but it's not. So it takes about to make a pair of blue jeans takes about 6 miles of cotton yarn to make that fabric. And before the Industrial Revolution, the fastest hand spinners in the world, who were Indians using the type of spindle wheel called the charka, the one that Gandhi uses in those famous pictures, they could spin enough thread to make a pair of blue jeans in about 100 hours. Which and that's one pair of trousers. And so if you think about a world in which that's the constraint, because weavers would be idle for lack of yarn, that was the bottleneck in the production, and you think about not only clothes but things like sacks for shipping or sails or tents, anything made out of cloth becomes much, much more valuable. And that's why when the Industrial Revolution starts with spinning, it ripples through the economy. It not only provides a model of what can be done by mechanizing and increasing productivity, using machines, but it also just very directly means that thread or yarn is abundant, which means that every kind of textile becomes much more abundant. And that means that everything from your clothes to the various bags and sails that people need for conducting international trade become less expensive and more abundant.
You also write about something you refer to as social technologies, a notion that I found really interesting. Can you describe for us what is a social technology and why those are important?
Yeah, so social technology is not my original formulation, but it's something I like because I thought of the book as very much about the story technology. So social technologies are innovations that help people do things together, I guess would be. I have a definition in the book. I forget exactly what it is, but and so that includes things that we think of as that are often described as institutions. So banks would be a social technology, but it also includes things like writing or Hindu Arabic numbers or bookkeeping, all those arithmetical techniques that you learned in elementary school. Somebody had to invent those, and they were disseminated in the early modern period in Europe by these schools that were set up essentially by textile merchants to educate their sons in doing arithmetic and keeping, and which then led feeds into the development of double entry bookkeeping, which also happens in that period. But before that, they were using Roman numerals, and they were doing using abacuses, and this is a major shift in a social technology that makes it much easier to conduct business. So I talk about things that are really familiar, like mail service is another one, to things that are a little more esoteric, like bills of exchange, which were the way that people could send money without actually sending like bags of gold over the Alps or something. How could you move money around Europe without actually transporting specie? And it's complicated, but it becomes really important in the early development of the banking industry, and also provides. It's hard for us to picture, but there was a time when currency was short. It is a common thing in if you go back far enough back in history, where there isn't enough stuff, the physical object, the coins or whatever, to conduct business. So one thing that bills of exchange allowed, they're developed to allow this long distance movement of money, but they also then become negotiable over time, and so it becomes a kind of paper money. And then another thing that I write about is textiles that are actually used as money.
Yeah, like bolts of cloth and things like that.
Bolts of cloth, standardized bolts of cloth. So it's not just bartering, I'll give you 2 bolts of cloth and you give me some milk. It's not that sort of thing. It's actually, this is a standard. This is recognized to have a certain worth, a certain value. And you can pay your taxes in it, and you can conduct business in it, and you can take it to court, and all of these things. And this was developed in different ways in different places. So again, in China, which is a much more sort of top-down bureaucratic system, it is the form of legal tender. The government says, these bolts, you have to take them as money, and it taxes in silk and hemp. But in West Africa, in the trade between West Africa and what's now Libya, so this is like the Middle Ages, and also in Iceland, it develops from the bottom up. So it's developed by merchants, and then becomes sort of part of customary law and common law.
Well, I came across an article that you wrote about a concept that you had from an earlier book that you wrote, The Future and Its Enemies. And that was that you had a model for stasis versus dynamism. And as I thought about that concept and then thought about your newer book, The Fabric of Civilization, I thought it really applied in a lot of interesting ways through the history of the textile industry.
Yeah.
If you would let us kind of take two of your books and kind of mix the concepts for a moment.
There are definitely examples in The Fabric of Civilization that don't fit into that model necessarily, but the idea of dynamism is that the way you make progress as a society is from people conducting experiments, saying, I don't like this, I think it could be done better this way, let me try that. And that could be in business, or it could be, it could be recipes, it could be living arrangements, it could be religion, any aspect of human endeavor. But you have this kind of bottom up experimentation, trial and error, and feedback. Not a lot of these experiments are not necessarily good ideas, but you sort of discover new forms of order, new forms of doing things better, and learning in a decentralized way. And I contrast, and it's an open-ended process. And I contrast that to what I call stasis, which takes different forms, but is the idea that, no, the kind of society we want is one that is very controlled, very predictable, It may be, depends. I have different types of stasis, but it may be an idealized sort of rigid, often in the past sort of system, or it may be, well, I do believe in progress. I want us to go forward, but it has to look exactly like this. And so in the history of textiles, I would argue that, when you back way up, it very much is this history of trial and error and learning through, form follows failure. I can do it better, sort of a bottom up. But it's not, it's not as if, governments never told people, let's do research on this or whatever. But a lot of the negative stories, or a lot of the stories where there is an attempt to impose a specific kind of ideal, it doesn't go well. So even the most positive story that I have in the book that's like that would be sort of the French government encouraging research into the chemistry of dyes, and starting again under Louis the 14th, who is this super technocratic control idea, and so they invest in science, and that's good, and they try to diffuse best practices across the industry. But as one of the historians I quoted say, there's a contradiction in it, because on the one hand, they want to make progress, which means doing things differently. But on the other hand, they want to say you can't do anything differently. So right. Which is it? And in fact, the invention of synthetic dyes does not come from France. It comes out of Britain and Germany, where it's coming more. I don't know if, again, it's complicated. It's not a purely entrepreneurial. Well, the very first synthetic dye is. It's a 18-year-old who invents it on Easter vacation and decides he wants to see if he could start a company to make money. In Germany, it becomes a little more state directed, but again, it starts with individual scientists seeing opportunities, and it only later becomes tied up with the state. So, I think the resistance to dynamism, sometimes it's ideological, and a lot of the Future and Its Enemies is about that sort of ideological resistance, but also it's often quite practical, and you definitely see that in the history of textiles. So when people invented these great spinning machines that we now look back and say, oh wow, the Industrial Revolution, it started the world on this road to riches, that's so fantastic, you don't have to spend 100 hours to get the yarn to make a pair of jeans. Well, there were people who were thrown out of work by that, and they protested. They went to Parliament. They said, "Don't do that. Let's get rid of these machines. Let's at least don't give them patents, which work differently from our patent system." But and powers that be said, no, these are good. We've been giving prizes and stuff to try to come up with something like this for a while. And then weavers did very well because they suddenly had enough yarn. And fast forward a generation after this golden heyday of hand weaving, and power looms come in. And this, which can be run not by these men who were expert weavers, but by teenage girls if necessary, who don't even have to know much. And you get the Luddites. The original Luddites, the most
famous anti-technology.
Yeah, right. The original Luddites were not anti-technology ideologues. They were guys who didn't want to lose their jobs at a time where losing your job could mean your children starved. This is not a trivial thing. But again, the government in Britain said no. And the Luddites, some of them just pursued peaceful, protest, write to Parliament, please help us. But there was also a lot of violence and
They
rioting,
smash
and
looms and burn buildings.
smashing looms and stuff, and there was a crackdown, and a lot of the Lodites were transported to Australia. Actually, that was a common punishment for those people. But again, it meant that there was this short-term genuine hardship. I mean, I don't want to minimize it, but the society, the world, in fact, was much better off by allowing that technology to go forward.
We'll zoom forward from when they were smashing some of those power looms, and that's when Francis Cabot Lowell was in 1811 and 12 touring mills in Scotland and England on a sort of family vacation, but he was searched like twice on his return by government officials because it was illegal to have blueprints for the loom, which he was careful enough not to do, but he's also smart enough to both memorize how they worked and then start working on actually the mathematics of how weaving could work and how the power loom could be improved, which is ultimately what he brought back to the United States.
Yeah. And I only tell one story like that in the book, which has to do with technologies that were in the north of Italy for twisting silk. But there are lots of stories like that throughout the history of textiles, of this kind of industrial espionage, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, in some cases it's and migration also. So knowledge in people's heads moving, so sometimes that's not an industrial espionage thing. Sometimes it is like the Huguenots in France are exiled and they go to Britain and they bring all kinds of textile knowledge to Britain. And then also there's forced transportation, there's forced migration. So I write in the book, and I also have a video on my YouTube channel and that has more detail about the Mongols taking weavers from basically Afghanistan over to the Uyghur kingdom which was adjacent to Mongolia, and that's the first transportation of Islam into that part of the world. I mean, there are other factors that developed later, but
good ideas tend to spread, and in
yeah.
entrepreneurship circles, we sometimes call it not copying, not stealing, but lateral innovation.
Yeah. Well, and another piece of the story that I tell, it comes up in different places, is you get a period once you start to have publishing as a profit-making enterprise for the masses. You start to get people writing down how to do things. So you get the first weaving manual that has patterns that can be copied, by people who haven't, and that's done by a weaver who wants to disseminate the knowledge. But you also have the first dyeing manual, which is a strictly entrepreneurial venture. The guy who did it was not a dyer himself, but he spent a long time, and I kind of doubt he made very much money on it because it took him so long. But he went around and got dyeing recipes from people in Italy and put together the first book of dye recipes. And this is before you have things like really accurate clocks or thermometers, or so they'll say things like, do so and so as long as it takes to say 4 Our Father prayers, that sort of thing.
How have ethical issues, if at all, revealed themselves in the development of textile production and demand through history? And do you see ethical issues revealed in some way in even today's textile markets?
Well, there are different kinds. I mean, when we think about ethical issues in the history of textiles, the obvious one that stands out really, looms large is slavery. Because the history of textiles, certainly in the US, is tangled up with the history of enslaving people and taking them first from Africa to the United States. But then, as I write in the book, there's a second exile when you start to develop cotton on the Western what is then the Western frontier, places like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, where you have people who are enslaved in the East who are taken from their homes, their families, et cetera, to develop that cotton frontier. And that's 1 million people. I mean, that's a lot of suffering. So that is one thing that is obvious. And the history of textiles, because it is human history, and humans are not, I mean, they're wonderful, innovative, brilliant creatures, and they're also really horrible people. I mean, people are in all of these things. So you get really horrible deeds being done as well. So, I mentioned the Mongols transporting people. Again, it's like 1,500 miles across the desert. Those are essentially slaves. So whether they're treated as slaves on the other end, it's not completely analogous to our knowledge, but there are certainly war captives. And so there are these issues of brutality. There are also issues that come up in that are less dramatic, which have to do with things like it used to be a problem that people would weave one end of a bolt of cloth in a really tight weave, really nice, and that would be the end that you saw when you went to the store on the outside. But then inside it would deteriorate. So there are lots of these issues about quality. How do you maintain quality standards? How do you maintain reputation? How do you avoid being cheated? How do you avoid getting a reputation for being cheated? So that and there are lots of struggles of, we have to regulate, we have to have the guild, we have to have a certificate, we have to have this inspector. That's one way that is done, probably with some benefits, but a lot of the things that it appears that really reputation becomes more important. So that's something. And then of course, one that's often emphasized is the issue of labor. So, aside from slavery, but free labor, what are the working conditions? Are they better or worse than the alternatives? Which is one thing that I think you have to ask that question, because we can't just say, I wouldn't want to work in that textile mill.
The earliest beginnings with Boston Manufacturing Company, because labor was very short, they put a lot of effort into thinking about who they would get, and they weren't highly paid, but they actually recruited young women who, before they got married, would spend a period of years being independent, making money. They provided education, and they started out the right way.
Yeah.
And the textile industry, along with the rest of industrial America, perhaps slipped into, I don't want to say quite the same sort of situation as Great Britain in terms of tensions between ownership and management and labor, but certainly conflict was there.
Essentially, so in the early days, these New England mill towns were amazing, and I don't write about this in the book, but it's a great, it's great stories. The mill girls, not only was it this opportunity to get off the farm and have some independence and get some cash, so that you could decide how you would spend your money, as well as, I'm sure many of them also sent money home to their families, but they ran newspapers, they had lectures, there was this whole little civil society in these mill communities, in the dorms, if you will, for lack of a better term, in the early days. But as the industry develops and becomes more and more competitive, and there becomes more and more pressure on the margins, some of that, you develop labor tensions because wages get pushed down, and the people who own the mills may be rich compared to the mill girls or whoever, but they are also pressured. And so it's an issue. I don't know if it's really, I don't know how much I would call it ethical issues. I think that depends on the circumstances. I think you can behave ethically and still end up in a bad situation where just because there's only so much to go around. Yeah. And then today, people are very concerned with environmental issues. And I would say, at least in the developed countries, but even in places to some degree in places like China, less so in India, but there is a lot of the research and thinking about the textile industry is looking at how it can have a lighter environmental footprint, whether that's a matter of, I was just reading before it came on about circularity. That means the materials just keep getting reused. And so, for example, a lot of polyester, you're starting to get more and more recycled polyester in fabric, but the recycled polyester tends to come from plastic bottles, like soda bottles, because they're easy to collect and they're easy to melt down and turn into more polyester. But it's harder to
collect. The whole natural versus synthetic fiber kind of debate is interesting. And you mentioned in the book, cotton, calling cotton natural is a matter of degree. Yeah. And I flash because I'm an agricultural person to a farm I visited in Brazil that's is the largest cotton farmer in the world, but they spray their cotton 33 times per season for insects and weeds and things like that.
Whoa, yeah,
it's environmental footprint.
Yeah, it's pretty. Yeah, cotton actually has quite a big environmental footprint. It is not, polyester. Depending on how you do the life cycle analysis, but generally speaking, polyester has a lower environmental footprint than cotton. Partly because cotton uses so much water, but also because in order to use particularly modern harvesting methods, you have to use a lot of not just pesticides, but herbicides, so you don't get weeds. And actually going back to the slavery story, apparently the worst part of working in the cotton fields was not picking the cotton. It was hoeing the weeds in the summer, because if you're in July in the deep South out there hoeing weeds, that is not a pleasant job. And at least when you're picking cotton, maybe you can have the satisfaction of seeing your bag get more and more full, whereas hoeing weeds is just kind of this endless, not very satisfying job and very unpleasant.
Well, Virginia, to this reader, it looked like development of this book must have been tremendously fun and interesting. You traveled to really interesting places and maybe some not so interesting, but you traveled to Iowa State University, which
yes, I did, which was really interesting, actually.
Different parts of the United States, those amazing spinning facilities in Italy, as well. Was that the case? I guess, and then at the end of the book, you also wrote about some forward-looking innovators and entrepreneurs that are working on interesting things going forward. As you think about the future, what do you find most intriguing about textiles?
Yeah, well, it was a tremendously fun book to research, and I still find it, looking at textiles, interesting to research. I recently wrote an article about polyester on for the website Works in Progress. But yeah, so. Well, one thing that I find very exciting and interesting, and that is already happening, and is the integration of computer modeling with 3D knitting. Typically, when most of the knitted cloth that's made, like what your t-shirt might be made of, is knitted in basically a long tube, which is then sliced, and then it's just the pieces are cut out the same way that they would be with woven fabric. But it's very, very fast to make that cloth. But there are other types of knitting machines that can actually knit a seamless garment. So you can knit a sweater that has its sleeves and but they're not sewn on. It's all comes off as one piece. And even more remarkably, you can knit a sneaker piece that comes out and it has different patterns of knitting. So like the arch is knitted in a different way from the heel, from where the laces are. You knit little holes for the laces to go through and all of that. And it comes out in this sort of slightly weird looking piece, which then you just bend and put a sole on and you've got a sneaker. And you can figure this all out on your computer screen, and increasingly there are libraries that model the fiber, the yarns from their databases that have models of the yarn, so you can build up a model of what the garment's going to look like on the computer. You don't necessarily have to make lots of samples. And this has a tremendous it has the possibility of eliminating a lot of waste, a lot of inventory that doesn't get sold, a lot of shipping stuff back and forth across oceans, and a lot of lost yarn, all of this stuff. And it's really cool too, you know? and that's happening. Then on a more sort of out there, more in the lab stage, there are people who are working on embedding various kinds of computing power into fibers that can be woven or knitted into textiles. And so I write about this place at MIT that's working on this, and this guy Yoel Fink, who is a material scientist who works on this. And fairly recently, his group came up with a way of embedding basically fibers that can hear into cloth. And part of that is the idea that like it can monitor heartbeats. Lots of possible uses. And then another thing that I am really excited about, I'm generally excited about the idea of synthetic biology, which in the content, which is essentially you program yeast to secrete something other than alcohol. So now, there's an ancient tradition of using yeast to secrete alcohol, and you get beer and things like that. But you can program them so that they will secrete silk proteins, or you can program them so that they will secrete indigo components, or that sort of thing. And I mean, there's a lot going on in synthetic biology that isn't specifically about textiles, but the things about textiles are potentially quite exciting, because you could have a whole new type of protein-based polymer fibers opening up from that. Again, it's not commercial yet, though.
A pitch yesterday from an entrepreneur working on synthetic biology to produce some basic components that, could be used for various plastic products, but also in textiles, using corn as the base ingredient.
So there's a lot going on in that area, and I think it's an incredibly exciting field in general. The textile piece is the piece that I first learned about, but I've since talked to people doing other things.
Well, Virginia, thank you for taking the time. Thank you for your book. I would encourage everybody listening to buy a copy, but how else would you encourage those that are listening to find your work and to follow you?
Okay, well, I have a website at vpostrel.com. And if you go to that homepage, there are links to my various social media things, like I have a YouTube channel where there are a bunch of videos that are related to textiles, including one I just made recently. I was just in Italy again, that shows some of those amazing silk throwing machines. I have a new Substack, so that's vpostrel.substack.com, and it has the very creative title of Virginia's Newsletter, because when I started it, I just thought it would be a newsletter, but then it turned into something that maybe needs a real title, but that's what it's called for now. And I write on that. I try to write on it something new once a week, and then something from my archives another time a week. So, yeah.
Wonderful.